Thank you guys for coming. I just wanted to get started here because I know you're very excited about our last poll before the June primary. So my name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. And thank you for joining us today, and thank you for those who usually see us at our other site. Should come over here to the court building, which is a beautiful building, but sometimes difficult to find when you're used to wandering over there. So we really appreciate you making the trek. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento. And for today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher Dean Bonner, who will present the findings of PPIC's latest survey on Californians and their government. We'd like to thank the James Irvine Foundation and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this particular survey. We'd also like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for helping to make this event possible, including the lunch provided today. At registration, you should have received a document that contains some of the key findings from the survey. The full survey report, along with slides from today's presentation, are also now available online at ppic.org. After Dean's presentation, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. A few more things before we begin. Our host, the State Library, let us know that there's a reception taking place here in the library and the courts building later this afternoon at 1:30 till 3, celebrating the opening of their exhibit, California in World War I, 100th anniversary of the armistice. This opening event, which is free and open to the public, will feature military experts in period uniforms, that's got to be hard to get through security, and light refreshments. The exhibit will be available to the public until March 2019. Also later today, you'll receive a survey from our survey team, so please fill that out about how we did today with our survey presentation. And please silence your cell phones. So we're a little less than 2 weeks from the state primary. I'm a Sacramento resident, so we have a new voting center here. A couple counties have that, so it's a little confusing. Remember, it's 2 stamps to mail your ballot if you're not going to go look for those voting centers. But I know most people are looking closely or more closely at the governor's race. And as we can tell from our poll, the race for second is really heating up. Right now, businessman John Cox is at 19%. Former LA Mayor Villaraigosa is at 15%. And the perennial favorite in our poll, Don't Know, is also at 15%. This will be a horse race for sure. And it's clear it will turnout will definitely play an important role in who will become one of the top 2 candidates in the race. Don't Know is running second in the U.S. Senate race with 36% of the vote, and Dianne Feinstein with 41%. But since we know Don't Know can't win or be in the top 2, there'll be a second place candidate to be named later. For those of you who are following congressional politics, our poll has a new feature, a look at competitive congressional races. This section will certainly be being read by most of the congressional delegation today, and we'll probably get some questions on it. But I really commend that section for you who are interested in congressional issues. And finally, my favorite part of our survey is our crosstabs. All of our crosstabs for both all voters, or for voters and all Californians, are always online. The questions and methodologies are also outlined for you if you have any questions. And so there's really, some of those things are captured in our narrative that's in the handouts for you, but there's really a great deal of detail that I think you'd find very interesting if you delve into that a little farther. Now with that, I'd like to invite to the podium PPI Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And as Deborah said, this is our final pre-election survey, which is always the one that's the most stressful for people with the numbers. But so this survey, beyond looking at the election, we're also going to touch upon some state and national issues that we feel are important as well. But prior to discussing the survey findings, I would like to discuss a little bit more about the Californians in their government series. About the mission of the statewide survey. So it's important to consider that, the survey, when founded back in 1998, this is our 20th anniversary, kind of the mission behind it was to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on important issues of the day. We seek to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. And since then, we've provided a voice for over 350,000 Californians on important state policy matters. In this survey especially, it's important to kind of realize that we're surveying, to begin with, we're surveying all Californians, and then we kind of drill down onto findings of those who we consider likely voters. So it's a little bit different methodology than other folks use at other places, where they may just be starting off with registered voters. But we feel this gives us opportunity to provide a voice for all Californians. So this survey series is funded by the James Irvine Foundation and the PPIC Donor Circle. This survey was conducted from May 11th to the 20th. And for those wondering, yes, these last few days have been a little bit hectic, having just got the data on Monday morning. Our polling at this time is 70% done on cell phone and 30% done on landline. We interviewed just over 1,700 Californians with a 3.1% margin of error and 900 likely voters with a 4.1% margin of error. The front section is dedicated mostly to the election stuff, and that will be, the findings I present will all be among likely voters, looking at the gubernatorial, US Senate, and the congressional elections. And then in the back half of the report and this presentation, we'll look at opinions on state and federal elected officials, the state budget, immigration policy, and healthcare policy. So we'll just cut straight to the reason that most people are here probably, the gubernatorial race. As Deborah mentioned, Gavin Newsom continues to lead the gubernatorial race, as he has since we first started asking this back in December. He's had a pretty steady share of the vote, from about 1 in 4 to just under 3 in 10 likely voters supporting him. And at this point in time, we also find that most likely voters are also starting to pay attention. Right now, we have 58% of likely voters saying that they're following news about candidates closely, either very or somewhat closely. That's up from 30% in January, so it's really kind of increased. And if we look back to the last time we had an open gubernatorial election, May 2010, about 65% were paying very or fairly close attention to news about candidates. So slightly higher than it is today. Cox and Villaraigosa are in a close race right now. The 19 to 15 with a margin of error of 4% is fairly close. And what we've seen basically since January is that Cox has a good bit of momentum and has increased his share of the vote each survey. Other candidates that we've asked about, Travis Allen, John Chung, and Delane Easton, lag a little bit further behind. And it's important for me to note that we've only included candidates in our survey who have independently verifiable campaign resources and organizations for statewide races. And in the case of gubernatorial race, we included 6 people in our survey. So in this survey, we find that Newsom leads Villaraigosa 42 to 19 among Democrats, while John Cox leads among Republicans by a 2-to-1 margin, 44 to 22. And it's interesting to me that among independents, Gavin Newsom and John Cox have equal support. And so this is in a state where independents, when you ask them which way they lean, they traditionally lean more towards Democrats than towards Republicans, but in this case, there's equal support. Latinos in Los likely voters kind of form the backbone of Villaraigosa's support. We also find that Newsom leads in the San Francisco Bay Area, and John Cox leads in the Inland Empire the Central Valley and Orange San Diego, while John Cox and Gavin Newsom are basically tied in the Inland Empire. So we also ask about how satisfied people are with their choices of candidates in the gubernatorial election. We've asked this since January, and in January, that number was 55%. It went up to 54% in January, 55% in March, and now 64% today. Even Republicans today have increased their satisfaction up to 60%, while it's increased 22 points since January among Republicans. I will say that Donald Trump, of course, endorsed John Cox on Friday before we started polling that day. And when you look at the weekend findings, there wasn't really an impact that we were able to discern, whether in satisfaction with candidates or with kind of a bump in support for him. Latinos are more satisfied than whites, although both groups have above a majority are satisfied, and majorities of men and women are both satisfied. About 6 in 10 or more across regions and demographic groups are satisfied. So at this point, there's a broad level of satisfaction, with, of course, Democrats the most satisfied. So just days before we began fielding our survey, there was the final gubernatorial debate. But how important are these debates? We find that 82% of likely voters say that it's either very or somewhat important, with 41% saying saying they're very important. More than 7 in 10 across regions, parties, and demographic groups say that it's at least somewhat important, and Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say they're important. It is interesting finding that the importance of debate declines across age, education, and income groups. So as people become older, more educated, and more wealthy, they view the debates less important. So moving on to the US Senate race, I should note that in the Senate race, we applied the same criteria for selecting candidates that we did in the gubernatorial race, and in this case, just 2 people met the criteria that we laid out. And in this race, we see that Dianne Feinstein continues to lead Kevin de León by double digits. She's led in January and March as well. But kind of the story here is that 36% of likely voters overall are undecided, including 59% of Republicans and 47% of independents. So a lot of this race will include kind of what happens with these Republicans. Now, there are Republicans in the race. There's a good number of them. And so when given that choice, it'll be interesting to see if there's going to be any coalescing behind a single Republican, or if, given the number, if it's just going to be spread out and these 2 folks will be the ones that eventually make it to the general election in November. 2 in 3 Democrats support Feinstein. Feinstein leads among men and women and among whites. And today, Latinos are divided. This wasn't the case in March when Feinstein led 41-22, or in January when she was up 47-29. And so the race is at the state that it is today, in large part because of the movement of Latinos towards Kevin de León. And so that will play a role in both June and November as we move forward. Dianne Feinstein leads Kevin de León across all regions, and her lead actually increases with age and educational attainment, I should say. In this race, half of likely voters are satisfied. 3 in 4 Democrats are satisfied, while majorities of Republicans and independent likely voters are not satisfied. Among those who are satisfied with their choices, 59% support Dianne Feinstein. Among those who are not satisfied, 57% are undecided. And so that will be a large part of the story in June. So California has been talked about as a battleground state when it comes to the congressional election, specifically speaking the House. And today we find that almost half of likely voters are extremely or very enthusiastic about voting for Congress. It is notable that Democrats are more enthusiastic than Republicans or independents. And it's also notable that I really was trying to parse out other things to say about this question, but it's notable that there aren't any real differences when you look at enthusiasm across regions or across most of the demographic groups that we ask about. Registered voters in our survey are somewhat more enthusiastic than registered voters overall, according to a May CNN poll. So perhaps that's good news if there's going to be, this idea of Democrats able to kind of make some headway in some of these Republican districts. But the fact is, there isn't a huge gap between Democrats and Republicans today. So when we actually look at the generic ballot for the U.S. House, today we find that just over half of likely voters say that they would support the Democratic candidate, with 38% saying that they support the Republican candidate. This is similar to earlier in the year when we've asked about this. Not surprisingly, most partisans say they will support their own party's candidate. It is noteworthy that kind of, when you look at these Democratic-held districts and the Republican-held districts, about 6 in 10 in the Democratic-held districts support the Democrat, and about 6 in 10 in the Republican-held districts support the Republican. And we came up with this by basically asking people what their zip code is, and then from there coming up with which congressional district they're in. And we started doing this back in March, and we'll continue doing this moving forward, because it does add a little bit of context to the story. When we look at the 10 districts that the Cook Political Report considers competitive at this time, which 9 of the 10 are currently held by Republicans, we see that the findings basically mirror the Republican-held seats, which isn't surprising considering 9 of the 10 are actually Republicans currently. But there will be 3 of those seats which will be open seats, so that'll be an interesting dynamic there. Registered voters in our survey are more likely than those in the May CNN poll to support the Democratic candidate, not surprisingly. So we've also asked about the preference of likely voters when it comes to what they want their kind of candidate for Congress to do, whether or not they want them to kind of push back against the Trump administration or to work with the Trump administration. And we find that there's an even divide here with, of course, Democrats wanting their candidate to push back and Republicans wanting their candidate to work with. Across racial ethnic groups, we find that 6 in 10 Latinos want there to be a pushback, while about 4 in 10 elsewhere say they want to work with the administration. We asked this question in 2 other contexts, one regarding the state superintendent race, and we found that there was about a 10-point gap between those saying they wanted to push back and those wanting to work with. So more people in that race, in that context, said they wanted to push back against the administration. And we also asked about, in the governor's race and in the Senate race, basically a question, and the findings were similar, with about 10 points more likely to say push back. But when it comes to the U.S. House race here, it's really closely divided. So that was kind of notable to me, and I plan on digging into that a little bit more to see kind of where some of the differences are, and potential blog that I'll be writing in the coming weeks. So turning to the kind of state and national issues that we asked about, as Governor Brown is in his final year, he he and the legislature are currently enjoying positive approval ratings. Governor Brown's approval ratings have been in the high 40s or higher since December 2012, and the legislature has had a net positive approval since September 2015. They've actually come a long way since May of 2010, when they were near their record low, when it was 16% saying they approve. So it was definitely a much different time then than it is today. As you might expect, Democrats are more approving than Republicans by a wide margin, and independents are actually more disapproving of the legislature than they are of Governor Brown. At least half of Californians in the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, and the Inland Empire approve of the governor, while approval of the legislature does not eclipse a majority across any region. So their approval is kind of really steady across demographic groups as well as across regions. About 4 in 10 white Californians approve of both the governor and the legislature, while the majority of Latinos approve of both. Turning to presidential approval, President Trump and Congress continue to lag behind the approval that we see at the state level with the governor and the legislature. President Trump's approval, since we started asking it in January 2017, has basically gone between 25% and 31%. So it's been a really narrow trend there. Sorry about that. And obviously, we have a longer time trend for Congress, and when we go back to that dates back to 2005, and what we see is that it's been below 40% since 2009. So they've had a long run of kind of a low approval ratings. Most Republicans approve of President Trump, of course. Most Democrats disapprove, and the majority of independents disapprove of the president. There's majority disapproval of Congress across parties, and when you look at Californians compared to adults nationwide, in a recent Gallup poll, adults nationwide are more approving of President Trump than Californians are in our survey, while they are, while for Congress, Americans are more disapproving than Californians are. It is notable that there's a 8-point gap between all adults and likely voters in approval of President Trump. Another number I'll throw out there is that 35% of registered voters actually approve of the president. And so just to kind of explain how we get there is that, you know, when we look at the registered voter kind of party split, Democrats are 20 points higher than Republicans, but then when we look at the likely voter party split, that goes down to 13-point difference. And so likely voters are definitely more Republican and thus more approving of the governor, of the president. So as Californians go to the polls, what type of issues are on their mind? We find that jobs in the economy and immigration are the top 2 issues. This is similar to what we found when we asked specifically about kind of the most important issue in the governor's race. We also see that jobs and economy is the top issue across regions, except in the San Francisco Bay Area, where 21% name housing as the top issue. As a resident of San Francisco, I can say that that's not too far off my sentiment in general. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to mention jobs in the economy, while Republicans are more likely than Democrats to mention immigration. We find that Latinos and whites name immigration as the top issue more often than African Americans and Asian Americans. Now, I'll say that, you know, jobs in the economy and immigration have consistently been near the top of this list for at least the last, since 2016 for sure. We also wanted to get a read on how Californians are feeling about the state overall when it comes to the economy. And we find that, half of Californians and likely voters say that they think in the next 12 months the state will have good economic times. Perhaps we shouldn't tell Jerry Brown this, because Governor Brown is very much saying that there's a recession coming, and he's probably right, but half of Californians don't necessarily feel that way. A majority of Californians have been optimistic about the state's economy since January 2017, and optimism has been higher than pessimism since December 2014. We find that majorities across Orange, San Diego, as well as San Francisco and the Inland Empire expect good times, while residents in the Central Valley and Los Angeles are divided. Men are much more optimistic than women when it comes to the state of the economy, and Asian Americans are more likely than other racial ethnic groups when it comes to the prospective economy. So Governor Brown recently released his final May revision, and he was nice enough to do that on the day we began fielding, which was 3 days ahead of the constitutional deadline. So if he's watching, thank you very much. Made my job much, much easier. He released a May revision that has general fund spending at $138 billion. That's $7 billion higher, roughly $7 billion higher than what he released in January. It has increased spending in the kind of major budget areas, puts just over $4 billion into the rainy day fund, and has nearly $4 billion in one-time spending. And when we read a brief description of that, we find that more than 6 in 10 Californians and 6 in 10 likely voters say they favor his budget proposal. 78% of Democrats favor it, as do nearly 6 in 10 independents. Republicans still half oppose his budget. However, support for the budget is pretty broad-based, with majority support across regions, age, education, income, and racial ethnic groups. So very broad-based support when it comes to his proposal. And of course, the proposal has no new taxes. When we look at his proposal for one-time spending, when we kind of read the description that you see here, nearly 8 in 10 Californians and 7 in 10 likely voters say they think that this is a good idea. Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents, but it is noteworthy that half of Republicans say that this is a good idea. Strong majorities across regions in age, income, education, and racial ethnic groups also say that this is a good idea. So, probably not a surprise, but Californians don't really trust government overall, and this has been true of Americans overall for quite a while as well. Here in California, currently we have greater distrust for the federal government than for the state government. In periodic surveys dating back to 2002, majorities have expressed distrust of the state government, but distrust today in the state government is at its lowest level since 2002. Since 2002, we've also seen that 6 in 10 or more have expressed distrust in the federal government. So what's striking about this picture, if you just look at the just the colors, the fact that, the only some of the time and none of the time, it's just very stark, that difference between the state and the federal. And why might that be? So when we look at how people feel regarding trust in the state and federal government, we find that 4 in 10 say they trust the state government just about always or most of the time, compared to 1 in 4 who say that about the federal level. 58% of Democrats trust the state level, compared to 17% who trust the federal level, and 1 in 4 or fewer of Republicans trust either level. And of course, Trust is low among independents as well. Half of residents in the San Francisco Bay Area trust the state government, compared to about 4 in 10 with residents elsewhere. We find that Asian Americans and Latinos are more trusting than whites and African Americans. And when we look at the federal trust, as I mentioned, 1 in 4 or fewer across parties, but then we find that 1 in 3 or fewer across demographic groups trust the federal government at this time. And this is an area that I've looked at a lot, and trust has kind of declined in our survey over time, but if you look back further to the federal government, trust in the federal government has just declined pretty precipitously since the 60s, if not a little bit before then. And so it's definitely something where we've just been seeing an erosion, and hopefully over the next couple of years we'll continue to follow this a little bit. So immigration policy is something we've really spent a lot of time on in recent months, and we wanted to come back and look at immigrants and immigration policy in the wake of the Department of Justice suing the state in March, and in the wake of that having Orange and San Diego counties among the kind of more prominent counties, as well as other cities signing on to this kind of idea of resisting the kind of state laws. But as we see, Californians, as they have in periodic surveys since 2004, think that immigrants are a benefit to the state because of their hard work and job skills rather than a burden. There's a stark partisan divide on this, as you might imagine, but we find that at least 6 in 10 across all regions and demographic groups say that they're a benefit. And this was similar when we asked a question last month about should the state be doing things separate from the federal government to protect undocumented immigrants. Even in the areas where we've seen kind of the pushback against state policy in Orange and San Diego, there were still 55% of residents who actually thought that this was a good thing that the state was doing. And so there's potentially a little disconnect between the kind of how the citizens of these counties feel regarding what the governments are doing at that level. So looking specifically at the undocumented population currently in the US, it's a question we've asked before. It was a national question at one point in time. And when you ask people, what should happen to undocumented immigrants currently in the US, overwhelming majorities of California adults and likely voters say that there should be a way for them to stay in the country legally if certain requirements are met. There's bipartisan support with 2 in 3 Republicans, 8 in 10 independents, and 9 in 10 Democrats saying they should be allowed to stay. 8 in 10 or more across regions say they should be allowed to stay. 3 in 4 across demographic groups say they should be allowed to stay. And the number that's really striking, despite the expected nature of it, is the fact that 95% of Latinos say they should be allowed to stay. In surveying, that's an expected finding, but it's the level of the finding. It's really hard to find 95% on on many different questions. So that is noteworthy that it's quite so high. Yes, it's expected to be high, but 95% is very rare in survey world. So turning from immigration to another oft-debated topic, healthcare, we wanted to come back and look at the Affordable Care Act as well as single-payer healthcare. So first, looking at the Affordable Care Act, we see that Californians today, slightly more Californians today have a favorable than unfavorable opinion of the law. This is down 13 points since last September. So if we think back, that was really an outlier, but if we think back what was going on during that time, that was kind of in the point in time where there was the efforts in DC to actually repeal the law. So what we saw was this increase in the favorability of it, but then today, we see that it's back down to where it was basically last May. And so, and as you can see, it's been a very volatile topic dating back to 2014. We find that favorable opinions eclipse 50% among African Americans, among Latinos, among college graduates, those making less than $40,000. And that's basically all the groups where there's a favorable opinion. And across regions, fewer than half have a favorable opinion. When we look at a recent Kaiser Family Foundation survey, adults nationwide have similar opinions of the Affordable Care Act. So now looking at an issue which has been kind of debated in the gubernatorial race, we find that, overall there's 2 and 3 support for the idea of having a guaranteed health insurance coverage for all Californians. But when you ask the people who said they favor it, whether or not they would still favor it if it means raising taxes, you see it decrease down to 41%. This is fairly consistent with what we've seen in the past when we've asked this question. And as well, we find that 3 in 10 are actually outright opposed to this. 3 in 10. And when we look at it across parties, of course, there are 6 in 10 Democrats who actually would favor it, even if it means taxes. Even higher share favor it if you include the overall. 30% of Republicans say they favor it, but that goes down to 17% if it means raising taxes. And then about 4 in 10 independents say they would favor it if it means raising taxes. Majority across demographic groups favor it overall. However, when you consider an increase in taxes, support drops below 50% across all groups except for among college graduates. So if it means raising taxes, you have college graduates and Democrats who are basically supporting it, and everyone else falls below a majority, which is interesting from the gubernatorial side of things as we move towards the election. So with the Mueller probe just turning a year, we kind of wanted to come back to this topic and ask people if they feel whether or not it was justified or whether it is justified or is it politically motivated. And basically, at this point in time, 4 in 10 Californians say that it's justified. And when it comes to, of course, the partisan divide, it's pretty stark with 7 in 10 Democrats saying it's justified, 8 in 10 Republicans saying it's politically motivated, and also nearly 6 in 10 independents who say it's politically motivated. The belief that it's justified only reaches 50% in the San Francisco Bay Area, and basically only reaches 50% among Democrats and college graduates again. When we look at the national findings of a May CBS News poll, Californians roughly similar to the opinions nationwide. But when we move from the investigation to whether or not there was interference, which is a question that we've asked in the past, we see that there's half of Californians who say that the Trump campaign intentionally helped, but if you add those top 3 numbers, you get 2 in 3 Californians who say that Russia did in fact interfere. And what we've seen since we first started asking this question about a year ago, there's been a growing consensus among Californians that there has been, or that there was an attempt at interference. But when you look at the kind of the 50% number, that stayed stable over time. So overall, the concept of Russian interference has become more kind of a norm among Californians, but the idea, but there just hasn't been movement when you look at the idea that the Trump campaign was involved. Across parties, There's bipartisan agreement that Russia did try to influence. However, when you look at just the idea of Russia involvement, it's a stark partisan divide once again, with just over 4 in 10 independents saying that the Trump campaign was involved. Across regions and demographic groups, majorities say that Russia tried to influence the election. However, it's a small subsegment of demographic groups and across regions where they actually say that the Trump campaign was involved. This is the Inland Empire, San Francisco Bay Area, African Americans and Latinos, younger Californians, and those with just a high school degree or those with a college degree. I did find it noteworthy that across all income groups, at least half of Californians said that there was involvement with the Trump campaign. So in conclusion, Gavin Newsom remains the top choice, as he has been since we first started asking about this in December. And what we've seen is the rise of John Cox, while Antonio Villaraigosa has basically kind of gone back and forth a little bit, and today is vying for second place. Senator Feinstein continues to lead Kevin de León. However, Republicans and independents are undecided. And it's important to note that there are more than just the 2 candidates that we named, including quite a few Republican candidates. Governor Brown's final budget receives positive reviews, and overwhelming majorities like his idea of one-time spending, which has been his mantra basically since he came back into office, that we're not going to have continued spending given the kind of up and down nature of our economy. Californians distrust state and federal government, and their trust in the federal government is lower than of the state government. We find that majorities across the state continue to view immigrants as a benefit, despite local tensions about whether or not the state should be doing what it's doing regarding undocumented immigrants. Californians are divided on the motivation of the Russia investigation, but a growing share think that the Russian government did try to influence the election. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes, one moment.
All right. I wanted to go. Oh, stop it. Randy Hicks, Californians Disability Rights. I wanted to ask you about the poll between de León and Feinstein.
Yes.
How much difference is it from the last time you polled with them to now, and how does it look like in the future? Just curiosity.
Yeah. Senator Feinstein has had a double-digit lead each time, although it's not as great today as it was in January or March. It's basically declined from March just a few points, but not quite as wide as it was then. Yes. Yes, one moment, just wait for the microphone.
Looking at your guys' report, you mentioned that of the Cook political report, the 10 competitive congressional districts, yes, that a Republican is favored, or in those 10 seats. Did you guys look at each of those districts individually, or did you look at them as a whole? And I guess my second question is, do you think you guys have enough surveys in those districts to say it with confidence?
The first question is we don't necessarily have enough sample to break out individual districts, if that's what you asked, sorry. And basically our Republican and Democratic held districts break down pretty roughly to what the share of those seats are in the legislature. And so I feel like the representation of the competitive districts are probably similar to that. And so I do feel comfortable with the number, but it is a kind of, anytime you're talking about a congressional district and kind of aggregating them, and there's, of course, 9 of the 10 are now held by Republicans, so it's not surprising that potentially the results are similar to the Republican. But it will be an interesting, as we move forward to see what happens, especially, with the concept of will there be one of the parties locked out and have a dim-on-dim or rep-on-rep in one of those competitive districts. So that's kind of what I'll be watching for sure. Yes.
Jeff Tartagia, an advocate. You've had a long time to do this survey in preparation for the primary. Now, for the November, how many times are you going to be able to pull this survey off between now and November? And statistically looking at from the 2 candidates, is it going to be tailored more specifically as 2 candidates, or with all of the initiatives that are going to be in the fall, are you going to raise any questions about the initiatives?
Great question. We will definitely be coming back to the gubernatorial race and the Senate race. But a big part of that balance is with only 2 candidates, right? So that allows us to probably come back to the idea of the favorability of the candidates, which with 6 and 2, it's kind of hard to dedicate 8 questions to favorability too many times. And so it will allow us to kind of tailor questions around those 2 candidates in each race. And so we definitely plan on coming back to it, and we'll, regarding the initiatives, that's kind of the big piece for us right now. Initiatives take a long time to ask. We are increasingly interviewing more people on cell phones, which take a little bit longer, which means that you have fewer questions overall. So finding that mix will be a big challenge and something that we'll be discussing over the summer for sure. And there's some really important ballot initiatives, and so you want to have a kind of a view of that, but at the same time, you also want to be able to ask other things, which are also important. So stay tuned.
Are there any generalizations you can draw about the undecideds in the governor's race?
The fact that the undecideds among Democrats and independents are the same is quite interesting. But to be honest, I haven't had a lot of time to actually delve into that too much, but it is something I plan on kind of looking at in the coming week or so before, because I do think independents are more undecided, and so what happens? I think it's 19%. So what happens with that 1 in 5 will play a large part, especially because if you look in the survey, Cox and Newsom are both at 18% among independents, but then you look at Villaraigosa and Travis Allen, and they're both pulling double digits support among independents. And so kind of what happens to the rest of those independents, I think will be interesting, considering that the divide between Democrats and Republicans right now is fairly even on that. So it'll be interesting to watch for sure. And I'm sorry I don't have more insight, but it's been a hectic 3 days.
2 questions. One is 2 other polls have come out at a similar time, and mostly they're mirror yours, but not quite. And so the question is, what do you attribute that to? And then the second question is, in this poll, as you have mentioned, it seems that independents veered a little more conservative than normal. Would you care to speculate on the reason that that might be?
Yeah. You know, regarding the kind of difference between our polls and other polls, most of the other folks out there now are doing online polling, and many of them are kind of including a full list of candidates. And so that's just a different dynamic. They're also kind of reaching a somewhat different group of people, because if you're starting from registered voters, that only includes people who are currently in the voter file, and so there's just a lot of differences regarding people who might answer the phone versus people who might be able to take a survey online, because we do have a portion of the population who, for one reason or another, does not have home internet or a phone with internet, and so that's a little bit different. And the second question, sorry, I blanked, was?
In this poll, compared to your other polls, independents seem to veer to the right or a little more conservative. Yeah. Would you care to speculate on why that might be?
What's interesting, when I look at the kind of the overall question of how people are answering our question of which way do you lean, among the registered voters, it's kind of similar to what we normally see, but among likely voters, it does hew a little bit that way. And you know, it's a snapshot in time, and so it's hard to really tell. We're definitely a state that has 1 in 4 are independent, so it's important to kind of understand where they're coming from. It could be that different types of people are becoming independents now, or and so because we have seen a drop in the major parties, and so it's something that will definitely be coming out later this year with a fact sheet on kind of who are the independents, and so keep an eye out for that for kind of more information.
Hey, Dean. Thanks again for your great work on this survey. As far as the governor's race and those that are undecided, did you guys look at how many of those undecideds fall into the category of happy with their governor choices, and how many fall into the unhappy, and how many are just, there's too many good choices, so I don't know what to choose from, and I hate all of them, I don't know which one to choose from?
That's a great question, and I'll have to follow back up with you. Because it's just something, I looked at it in the Senate race, given the sheer number of people who are undecided, but I did not get around to doing that in the gubernatorial race, but I'll shoot something your way. Yeah. Last one?
Yeah, I know you touched on immigration overall, and it seems across the board that the majority of Californians favor immigration, that they find them beneficial. I was just wondering if you had any statistics on specifically like sanctuary cities and what the constituency feels about that.
In recent months, we've asked more about the state government, asking them kind of, how do you feel about the state making policies separate from the federal government to protect undocumented immigrants? And we saw a steady share of people, pre and post the kind of DOJ suing, with just over 6 in 10 saying they favor the state government doing that. I do think you see that, overall California is very supportive of immigrants, and so, even in the kind of more conservative areas of the state, you can see that there's support for doing things to protect undocumented immigrants. We haven't asked in a while about specifically using the term sanctuary state or city, basically because over the last 2 years, the governor has signed probably 5 or 6 bills that became law that did a variety of things to protect undocumented immigrants, whether or not it's providing driver's license or allowing them to get professional licenses, or the 3 laws that the federal government are currently suing about. And so we feel that this question kind of captured more of a nuanced look at what the state is actually doing. And so we'll probably be coming back to it again, given the kind of local tension that we're seeing. But stay tuned for sure. Thanks, everyone, and be on the lookout for more stuff in the fall, for sure. Take care.